This episode of ChatGPD was made possible by the hard work and creativity of our production team. A huge thank you to Emily Young, Chris Sang, and Alakia Chandran for their expert production, editing, and behind-the-scenes magic that brings each conversation to life. We also want to thank Sarah Topa and the IMS for their support in helping us share ideas, stories, and resources that empower our grad students at every stage of their journey. Welcome to ChatGPD, our podcast on careers in biomedical sciences. I'm Pamela Plant, and I'm the Director of Graduate Professional Development here at the Institute of Medical Science at University of Toronto. Today, I am with our guest, Dr. Teja Mullapudi, who is a principal and scientific lead at Noetic venture capital firm. Welcome, Teja.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're so pleased that you could come here today to talk about venture capital. And maybe that's where we can start. Could you tell our listeners, mostly graduate students in biomedical science, what venture capital is in lay terms?
Absolutely. Yeah. So venture capital in the simplest terms is a bit like financing and direction if you want to build something drastically different in society today. So if you want to change the way, for example, people communicate, back in 2000, what was considered a bit like a peer-to-peer communication gap that existed across the world. Some people thought we could make that happen in a different way. That's how social media networks started. You could think of LLMs today. 10 years ago, someone thought we could change the way we search for information online and how that's put down together in a document. That's what resulted in a bit of a revolution that we see today is a bit of a common tool. In life sciences, you can think of CRISPR, technology that we learned from bacteria using in its own self-defense. It's now being used to treat patients with genetic conditions. So things like that, heavily transformative technologies which require to be developed and deployed at scale, those are the type of technologies venture capital is uniquely positioned to support and scale and bring to society. Maybe one additional point I'll add is usually venture capitalists, have a bit of a dream or a vision or a thesis behind, what they're doing. I'll give you our fund's example. We believe, myself and others at the firm, that mental health, the way it is treated today, is quite archaic, a bit like how cancers were treated 20, 25 years ago. So we fundamentally believe that mental health treatments should be different, more personalized, more curative in nature. What we do is support companies, startup founders, people with ideas on how to do so. We support them financially as well as from a strategic or a directional perspective to actually build what is now an idea in their mind into what becomes a technology, a medical treatment, or the way people treat people with mental health. And in return, usually the founders who would otherwise have spent a lot more time looking for grant funding or the government to actually help them do things, they would give a part of the equity of their company to us in return for us accelerating and helping them scale some of these innovative technologies. That in a nutshell would be what venture capital would be.
So you're providing financial support through investors, and you're also providing direction. And usually these are higher risk projects that are not going to otherwise be funded because traditional mechanisms with banks, etc., traditional investment mechanisms are probably averse to high risk projects. So disruptive technology usually implies higher risk. And is that basically what venture capital is centered around?
Absolutely. I think you speak the language of the finance folks when you speak about risk, and that really is the currency in which venture capital deals. Technologies that promise a big change are often considered risky by governments or grant funding, and there may just not be enough incentive for these organizations to actually spend too much dollars in a direction that today may not be how could be efficient from a tax dollar perspective. So therefore, there is this niche of folks who invest in these transformative ideas.
Now, I'm curious because it is very financially oriented, And you have come from a scientific background. So, can you walk us through your journey of how you got to where you are today?
Absolutely. I started off with engineering in India growing up. Did my engineering bachelor's and master's in biotechnology initially. As an engineer, you start thinking mainly about applying known knowledge into inventions, into technologies that change the way we do things, invent things, change where change is required. What I didn't realize at that time was, I also was very deeply interested in biology and understanding natural phenomena. And when I did my master's thesis, this was in mainly working in viruses. So I was trying to understand how viruses actually enter cells and then integrate themselves into our own DNA. This is HIV that I was working on specifically. And what fascinated me the most is viruses, in some way, are nature's own engineers. So they, you know, actually infect cells. They go in, they find their way into the genome, and then from there, they direct how an individual actually behaves. And if you extrapolate, if you look at the coronavirus aspect, it's not a virus that integrates with the DNA, but still, it actually changed the way society worked for a long time just to get this virus to multiply, right? So I looked at the virus and I thought this is nature's, one of nature's ways of engineering biology, in a way. And so fascinated by that, decided to pursue a PhD down the route of how can one use these type of tools to actually develop new therapies. And I went down the rabbit hole of looking into stem cell therapies. They were using viruses to actually change cells into pluripotent stem cells, and then program them into the type of cells that could be therapeutic in application. That's how I came across in my PhD a consortium of researchers, which I was part of from a stakeholder perspective. There were clinicians, there were pharma and biotech folks, and so learned a lot about how a research finding translates into what would be a clinical application, and how pharma or biotech actually are involved in trying to take this basic understanding into that in a path that is actually commercializable. Because without that, sometimes your research can end up being research and just waiting for somebody to come and actually apply it to the world outside. So I realized that if you start thinking about the clinical commercial aspects ahead of time, you could actually very nicely shape the type of research you perform. That fundamentally changed, towards the third or fourth year of my PhD, of a 4.5 year PhD. I decided that that's where I would spend a lot more time, actually translating knowledge into society, into commercial applications. I started looking around, and I, funnily enough, met somebody on a flight that talked to me about, I can expand on that a bit later, but talked to me about venture capital for the first time, learned about it, and that's how I came to know and apply some of that scientific knowledge into this space of venture capital. Happy to go deeper into those areas.
I would imagine your expertise would be incredibly valuable in a VC firm. Your analytical thinking, your expansive knowledge of commercialization from the research perspective. What are the skills that you really were able to translate from your PhD into the current role that you have at your VC firm?
Oh yeah, I think I initially thought, because most of us are usually surrounded by people who have similar skill sets in the PhD or a master's, and therefore you may actually disregard some uniquely positioned skills as being, oh, everyone around me knows that, right? I'll quantify that maybe with an example. Not myself, but my wife actually, after her PhD, graduated and then worked with Boston Consulting Group, which is a big consulting firm, hired at the same level as a Harvard MBA grad, right? That kind of blew my mind, and actually started thinking, if a company like BCG is hiring somebody with a PhD at the same level, they must know something about the skill sets that we have, right? And so started thinking and looking back and realized people with PhDs, people with master's degree, people who do research are actually uniquely positioned, because it's the only place where you are, in a way, navigating ambiguity and complexity on a daily basis. You have no idea. Nobody's told you this is exactly what you need to do, and yet you show up every day. You design your own sort of plans and experiments, and you test them. It's actually that attitude of not knowing what the end looks like, but still, putting in the effort. I think that's unique. I think most grad students and PhD students actually don't realize how valuable that is. Add to that, we've been systematically trained during our studies how to contextualize things and explain what we did, what we found, and what it means. This, if you translate into more of a business talk, is context, contrast, and meaning, right? It's a key skill. Most business folks actually also don't understand this as being the fundamental reason for why they're able to influence or not a particular, decision. We've been, for example, instead of saying, oh, this company, is much better because it can do a cheaper clinical trial, you have to be able to contextualize. For example, in the space of oncology, which is traditionally known for poor, duration of efficacy, this company for the first time promises a therapy that is the longest duration of efficacy, and therefore this means that a return on our capital invested is the highest. So this type of a context, contrast, meaning language isn't inherent to people who may have not thought about introduction, methods, results, conclusions, which is what, or a discussion section, which is how we've probably been forever trained, in every experiment. The last thing I'll add is, what we are uniquely positioned is, most businesses, most problems are messy. You have 20 or 30 different variables affecting why a company is profitable or not. And most business people do not know how to tear that apart. But as scientists who perform controlled experiments day in, day out, we are uniquely trained to identify what's changing, how to actually how to not change 5 things together, but only one variable, and then test hypotheses around whether that's resulted in a desirable or undesirable sort of effect. So if a company is not profitable, how do you actually find out why is actually the same problem? So there's aspects like that, which I think, the big consulting firms know we do well, and that's why they hire people at the same, level as a Harvard MBA. So maybe those.
That was a really good summary. Thank you for that. I've never really thought of it in terms of just like applying your business problem solving in business context as purely an experiment, that you are just redesigning. Your subjects are not cells, they're people and businesses, but the same concepts apply of trying to solve the problems. Now, the leap from your PhD to the business world is, very intimidating, and it's quite a big one. And a lot of our graduate students who are listening are like, how can I possibly make that leap? So could you just kind of tease apart that time between that meeting, that chance encounter on the airplane, and what are the steps you did? What are the tools that you resourced? How, maybe did you take any courses, or how did you get the language, or how did you build the confidence to make that leap between your PhD and the VC world?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of impressions of what people or sectors or jobs look like after, but you don't actually know until you speak to 10 or 15 people who do the same role. To know whom to speak to, you also need to start internally first. Is what do I want to do? What am I good at doing? So one of the most useful exercises I ran, or at least I underwent, in some ways, was to sort of map what are the things I really love, looking back at my PhD, looking back at my engineering times, and all the extracurricular things I did while I was doing those things. And I was able to identify that I really loved working on complex problems. I wanted to break things down and solve them individually and put it all back together and say, this is what this means. I loved that process, both during my engineering and my PhD. I loved, speaking to people and talking to and working in teams. And that's something I realized I wanted to do more of. What I realized I was also good at was, navigating ambiguity, where people feel stressed. I think our PhD and my engineering training told me or taught me how to be resilient through that. There are times when nobody knows the answer. So based on that foundation, I started to actually then speak to people, 15 people I spoke to were in the pharmaceutical space, for example, post a PhD or a master's. I spoke to them, understood whether what I really wanted to do, what I loved and what I was good at, whether they found that, happening in their daily life now that they're in a role, right? So uncovering some of those insights, just speaking to people, was one of my biggest unlocks. In terms of tools, I realized, I didn't know I would be working in venture capital when I was in grad school. So if anyone's, wondering if they haven't prepared enough, it's never too late, in essence, right? So I think what I did after is essentially work in teams, took up extracurricular activities that put me in a position that was uncomfortable. I was heading up a few student organizations back in the day. That taught me a lot about how, people, who are not, your boss or somebody working under you or with you, how do they think and how do you influence their mind towards a common goal that we are all, working towards. As an example, we actually set up a career fair for students because we ourselves felt not enough education about the topic was out there. So just organizing events like that put me in touch with a lot of people, which enabled conversations. It's a bit of a loop. You speak to more people, you start introspecting. I would advise that may be the first place, from a tools perspective, that may be the first sort of loop you want to establish in your, exploration right now. That exploration will identify specific, tools and skills. Even those that, I did a course on venture deals, for example. It's an online free course that tells you the basics of what a startup is. What is equity, what does a founder give away when they're taking on capital this way, what does a venture capitalist get. So there are online courses, plenty of them. But I think from a tools perspective, just I would put the people speaking aspect as one of the nicest loops that got everything into motion.
Yeah, you have to put yourself out of your comfort zone and really just talk and gather information. And in that process, you really discern a lot about yourself, what feels right, what areas you want to interrogate a little bit more. And then that eventually leads to the key people that influence your next decision. But sometimes it does take 15 people to talk to you before you even feel comfortable. So can we just get into the meat of a VC role? What do you do every day? I mean, and again, every guest, it's a loaded question because no day is similar. But can you walk us through like typical days or weeks? What you're doing, what are some of the good things about your job and bad things about your job? Just let us understand the role a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think like most roles, there are, phases and cycles depending on the market, depending on the organization, and which trickles down into what you do. So every day is a bit different, but, in the spirit of the question, right? So I think I spend around 25-30% of my time mainly looking for, interesting ideas that are out there, researching the latest publications, researching the latest trends in how, neuroscience drug discovery is happening. For example, for me here in this fund, I would be looking at the latest drug approvals, for example, that are happening, or decisions around reviews that are happening, and understanding why that is the case. This is basic research, one that we are used to. This is where I would say the job has the biggest overlap with what I've traditionally always done, which is the basis for me performing well in other aspects, right? This 25-30% forms the foundation for everything else, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about now, which is the rest of the time is divided up into actually taking external meetings, speaking with founders who are pitching you with an idea that they think is going to change the way mental health is treated in my case, or whichever other industry that venture fund is focused on. So now, because of the first research phase that I talked about, you can actually almost diligence, you can almost vet what the founder is saying to be grounded in reality and evidence, or a bit of an extrapolation. And that is quite important to understand. Then you can actually talk to KOL, key opinion leaders, who can potentially advise you also about whether or not you're thinking right, and whether the founder and the company is actually based in evidence and will achieve what the founder says. The rest of the time is actually divided up into, maybe around the last 20-30% is divided up internally, sharing with my team, organizing investment committee memos, internally conveying to people who are not scientists what the science means for a business decision, right? So to our investment committee, I translate what is technical, in the context, contrast, meaning type of framework that I talked about, actually communicating with them why this is a good decision or a bad one. There are also aspects around travel. You meet, you actually go to meetings sometimes, as well. And there are portfolio companies. Once you have made an investment in a company, we actually support those companies well as well. And I'm on a couple of board roles that help these companies bring maybe governance aspects, some from a scientific perspective, some from actual governance as a how to run the company perspective as well, because we've seen a few other companies run, and we can save new founders some of the heartache that some of the other trajectories show us from other companies. So I would put the last 20-30% there as well.
And neuroscience, your firm is focused on neuroscience. Was that something that you were interested in? Did you have some kind of a background? Obviously your PhD wasn't in neuroscience, but why neuroscience? Was it just something that you fell into naturally, or is it something that you sought?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I don't have a neuroscience background. When I graduated from my PhD, my expertise was in diabetes, and essentially bringing stem cells to what I would say at that point part of the consortium to be an effective therapy. I joined Mars Innovation, which is now called Toronto Innovation Acceleration Partners here in Toronto. We worked with, in that first role, I worked with around 13 member organizations in the Toronto ecosystem, including U of T. And our mandate and my role there from a scientific perspective was to understand research happening in the Toronto ecosystem, identify research that today is not a company, but has the potential to be a company if you put a certain amount of money behind and some expertise behind this research. That allowed me to learn, aspects of science commercialization, which are universal. Beginning with diabetes as my, core area of expertise, got to see, oncology, muscular, indications, neurodegeneration, worked on a lot of metabolic indications as well. So what I learned, very quickly is, your PhD could be an area which, only 3 people in the world understand what you exactly do. But once out of it, it goes into several layers of, generalization. You could start working immediately across therapeutic indications, because the principles of what is pathological and then what you need from a therapy perspective are similar. And then you can extrapolate even further, saying what is scientific and what is a process for doing hypothesis-based testing is actually generalizable to the business world. So all of these as layers extrapolate pretty quickly into translating what was a very specific PhD degree of mine in diabetes, stem cell therapy and whatnot, into neuroscience, drug discovery, development, or even medical device-based interventions, because the principle underlying those is the same.
Right, and the core competencies, the critical thinking, analytical thinking, you are not a product of what you study. You're a product of how you study it.
Exactly. Well,
and you can apply that to pretty much any topic, which really, again, is another plus for a PhD going into this role.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if you can just comment on the VC space, particularly in Toronto. I would imagine it would be one of the stronger areas across the country. But start with Toronto and then maybe the VC landscape across Canada. It always seems that VC is, much more pervasive and entrenched and expansive in the U.S. With the centers of innovation, New York, California, Texas. Can you talk about Toronto? Is it getting there? What is what is the what is the footprint of VC like in Canada?
Absolutely. I think the US is, of course, in many ways, always a scale higher or an order of scale higher than Canada in terms of, capital deployed into innovation, technology, research, and so on. I think what maybe from a Toronto ecosystem perspective, it may not be as active and bustling as a Boston or a or a Silicon Valley type of environment, but I think it punches well above its weight in terms of research publications across the world. It does a great job of identifying innovative technology and translating it. We have traditionally been, I would say, underweighted in when it comes to venture capital compared to other geographies. Compared to the US in specific. I think life sciences venture capital in Toronto, there are a handful of big venture capital firms that actually deploy capital. The other aspect around venture capital, especially as it relates to career opportunities, the roles are ones that are specific are usually low churn, which means that once somebody takes up a role in a venture capital firm, they usually stay there for several years, and the teams are pretty small, which means not too many roles open up. Due to a combination of there being less firms to begin with and less turnover within the firms. And for that reason, I think it's usually considered an area where not too many openings, not too many firms show up, and so therefore always runs under the radar. But I think that is an opportunity. I think we are seeing trends where the Canadian VC landscape is going to be world leading in many ways. If you look at sectors like AI, I think our research expertise is well above and beyond some of the other hubs of innovation across the world. And so therefore there are a lot of companies in the AI space that are launching here backed by VC. And of course when I say AI, it intersects with every industry. So healthcare, for example, is an industry which you can make a cross between AI and healthcare, and therefore uniquely position Toronto as a place where AI in healthcare could be a great opportunity. So we need more people, we need more institutions to actually support such kind of innovation in Canada. And I think graduates and folks who would be coming into the space, if they come in with that opportunity set rather than the limitation of there being a few set of opportunities today, I think that opportunity set is going to shape a much bigger industry in Toronto than what it is today.
And do you think that are we on an exponential growth right now, or is it more of a plateau? Where is the field of VC going in the next 5 years? Is this a good thing for students to kind of go into? It sounds like it is. I don't know if you can comment on, what are your projections? What do you think the landscape is going to look like in the future?
Absolutely. I think, if someone's really keen to actually see their research come all the way into the clinic and shape the way in which we treat therapies at scale, I think venture capital is one of the most promising ways in which you can do that. In the next 5-10 years, 5 years is actually not a big time cycle in venture capital. Most funds actually run for 8 years. Most investments that you make, you only know whether or not that's a good investment in 5 years, actually. So it's not a big time frame, but there is big change happening. You can already tell most big VC funds are actually becoming bigger and are deploying capital much later, which means that the opportunity set for being specific to a certain sector. So, for example, like our fund is only venture capital in mental health. So you will see a lot more venture capital firms rise that are specific to the problem and will be problem focused rather than product focused, which is an interesting distinction which I can expand on if helpful. The other trend you may see is, entry-level positions in venture capital may require more than just one skill set. I'll give you an example. When I joined, venture capital, as in an entry-level position, it was great to be, an expert in the scientific aspects or the technical aspects. But now, some of those aspects can actually be, to a good extent, one can achieve those through, the large language models that are out there. So therefore, I think it is important to be an expert in two things or three things. It's almost like you need to be an expert. You're jack of multiple
Jack of
trades,
all
and
trades.
yeah, jack of all trades, and you have to be good at least three or four of them type. So which means you could pick areas that interest you. For example, AI, combine it with your technical expertise in life sciences, and that would be, I would say, in a 5-year cycle from now, that would be the skill set required almost of anyone coming into the space. Or you may talk about operational, so you may be really good in actually strategy and healthcare. You may be good at finances and healthcare. So two skill sets, I would say, would be great for somebody thinking in 5 years from now, what would look like, what would my skill set, what should my skill set look like, as I think about VC.
So it sounds like the nature of VC is that you put many pokers in the fire and you hope that one of them, works. So what is the typical percentage of success of the companies that you invest in, and how many actually do take off?
Yeah, actually, if you look at retrospective data, it is low, the number of hits, but it depends on firms and expertise, and whether someone is domain specific as opposed to generalized VC. There are numbers around, you will have 3 companies out of a 20 position portfolio that will perform 10 times return or 100 times return, on a 10 to 100 scale, right? On an order of magnitude increase in your investment. Most of the companies usually, so I would say around 8 of those 20 may end up in the 1-time return to 5 times return window, or a 10 times return window at most. And then the rest of them, actually, a good number, a sizable number, may actually end up being zero, which means you've actually lost the money you've invested in it. That's not entirely, unexpected, because most of these ideas are about, are drastic, bold, and they want to change the way fundamentally how society operates in some cases. Sometimes it just does not work out because of market aspects that has nothing to do with technology. An example of that is, for example, we've seen in the neuroscience space, we've seen technologies that can be used in a preventive case to help people avoid a depressive episode, actually not have a depressive episode. Let's say somebody is in remission right now and they have the chance of relapsing into depression. There are technologies that can actually predict and maybe even prevent somebody from having that relapse. However, insurers or regulatory authorities sometimes may not fully grasp that, and they may not be the ones who make money on such a preventive model. And so for those reasons, sometimes a company that's developing this technology or product never succeeds, fails, right? So for those reasons, sometimes venture capital does feel like, you place 20 bets and only 3 companies are actually coming up, but that's part of the sort of distribution. You go in knowing, you can't control a bunch of other factors or variables here.
And is that why VC in Canada, particularly in healthcare sector, is probably more attenuated than it is in the US because of our socialized healthcare system? So for us to adopt these technologies on a national scale or even a provincial scale requires a lot of buy-in from the government, and that probably is a big hurdle.
Indeed. I mean, to be honest, I think every system, socialized or capitalistic in nature, will have some challenges with regards to adoption of new technologies. Everybody's resistant to change because everybody, not many people's job depends on change. Many people's job depends on status quo and doing what is being done today. Canada specifically, I think there is an issue around life sciences venture capital, mainly because most institutional investors in Canada stay away from investing in life sciences VC funds. I say that as a contrast to maybe how institutions in other geographies work. It's not zero in Canada, but it's a much, much lower proportion to an extent that actually some major institutions invest in life sciences VC funds outside of Canada, but not in Canada. And also they invest in a lot of VC funds that are not life sciences, but not life sciences in healthcare. And that's partly because in the past they may have burnt fingers, trusting maybe not the best managers or the best funds, but also, I think mainly because, when someone's offering you, the opportunity to invest in crypto, and you contrast that with, an 8-year wait for, a life sciences healthcare fund, it is sometimes more attractive to invest in a 3-year return
They want a
cycle on
quick buck.
crypto. Yeah.
And sometimes the life science health sectors, the waiting periods are longer.
Yes.
It takes a long time for a drug to become, a blockbuster.
Right.
There's lots of testing. There are lots of, different healthcare hoops to go through.
Yep.
And it's not going to be a quick turnaround.
Yeah.
Might be more lucrative over the long run, but it's a waiting game.
Yeah.
And that would be prohibitive.
Absolutely. And my thesis is always to focus on also things that we can control sometimes, right? And you can't always control how somebody else makes their decisions. But I think one area in which we as a life sciences venture capital industry can take ownership and do something about is how we communicate what we do, and the type of returns that exist here, and the type of, job creation opportunities and other things that, different stakeholders always are thinking about. The government is worried about jobs, for example. We can do a better job communicating some of that out. Some firms here in Canada are doing a great job. You can look at, for example, Lumira Ventures is an example, being a very open and sharing with data, sharing what life sciences venture capital could look like if supported much more here.
So I want to get back into your day and what you haven't really talked about, what you love about your job. I'd love to hear what is the best part of your job.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's few jobs and roles in the world that put you at the precipice, almost at the edge of what is today known or status quo, and give you a peek of what maybe the early adopters, maybe the top 1% of early adopters in the world are actually already using or will be using. And you can make the claim almost that you get to be not just a fly on the wall, but if it actually passes all the checks and balances of your own diligence, you could actually play a role in making that part of the broader society, right? So few roles, I would say, give you the thrill, like in our PhD or like in our masters, where you can go home and talk to your mom about it, and your mom would not understand much about what you do at all. But 3 years later, your mom could be using that same technology, right? So that type of peek into what the future looks like is something I think very unique. I really enjoy that. The other aspect I really love is, there's always people who are way more passionate, smarter, and a lot more experienced than you are in the room in VC. So I've always met, founders who are so deeply passionate that the world almost thinks they're crazy. But you look into it, you do your research, and you go, maybe this person is talking about a very promising idea, and we just don't grasp it because it's so different from what we look at as reality today. So always challenges me, always makes me question things that I've assumed won't change. Like I'll give you an example, like the toothbrush, the way people brush teeth has always been the same forever. Like for a time, as we know, why can't we brush all 32 of our teeth like at the same time, right? So things like that, you start going when you're brushing your teeth, you're questioning, why am I doing this one by one when there could be a machine that does 32 of them together? That's a bit of a, I would say, a personal thought around, always being around people who question things. So it changes the way you fundamentally think, I think.
Disruptive thinking.
Absolutely.
I love it. That's what really causes seismic shifts.
Yeah.
What do you like least about what you do?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's like every job. It's challenging because you're working always with folks who have expertise sets that are very different from you. So what could be completely obvious to you, you may spend an extra hour or two convincing and bringing somebody else along to actually understand, an obvious reality that you see. I'll give you an example. I'm the scientific person on our team, and so for me sometimes it's quite obvious, a certain direction. I need to do this way because scientifically this would be the best. But sometimes, to the folks more business minded or even external folks, that may not be as obvious. And so for the journey of bringing somebody along, convincing, that is something I would say sometimes can be challenging. And you may have to pick your battles in some cases. The other aspect I would say is, you deal with a lot of personality types. I would look at it as an opportunity. You learn how to deal with different personality types as well, and that's part of the challenge of the job as well. Valuations, for example, are a technical or a component or a how do you value a company. If a founder comes and says, my company is worth 50 million, invest in my company, I'll give you 5%. You could make the counter argument, no, I think your company is worth only 10 million. So if I invest a certain amount, I should get a lot more of your company. That negotiation can actually be, sometimes it's not science, it can be an art sometimes, especially at the early stages. And that can be a bit of a challenge that, data can help solve for, but it is an ongoing challenge in the VC space. How do you arrive at valuations?
And is that something you do, or is there a specific valuation team that would do that?
Yeah, I'm pretty much helping that or support that answer based on data. But at the end of the day, you do factor in, how experienced the management team, the founder team is. So let's say you can look at some of these recent AI companies. Just because one of the co-founders of OpenAI, or the chief scientific person at OpenAI, is setting up a new AI company. Day one, with no product, this company is valued at like 300 or 400 million. So there are those non-technical aspects that, also you need to factor into your valuation process. So for those aspects, which are less technical, more on that side, I trust my team and their expertise in, coming to maybe a number or a quantified yes or no or a directionality on that aspect as well. It is a team effort at the end of the day.
Well, Teja, we've come to the end of our time, and I've learned so much from you. Sounds like such a fascinating world, and you can clearly see the passion that you have and the excitement that you have for your job. And I would love to just part with one final challenge, which is in a minute, I would like you to pitch the role of a venture capitalist specialist or principal to our listeners, to potential grad students that are potentially, thinking of this role. In 1 minute, just let our students know why they should consider a role in venture capital.
Absolutely. I think venture capital is uniquely positioned to offer someone the intersection of technical and scientific adventure on a daily basis, with actually seeing it being implemented in the real world and actually scaling, creating an actual product and taking it out to the market to test it. That intersection, there's few jobs that I think allow you to do. And in many ways, you should, pursue venture capital, not because it's going to be good for you, but also because it's what society needs. Society needs technically gifted people to actually operate in the financial world, and to help be good shepherds of capital, as we think of it. Because in the absence, you may find a society that may, the loudest mouths can win, or can actually prevail, as opposed to the most data-backed, opportunities. So my appeal to, students is learn about venture capital, and I think you'll find it very fulfilling as a job, and it's not as um, you know far away from what you do on a daily basis and enjoy anyway.
And you were also generous enough, thank you, that was an excellent summary. You were generous enough to say that you will post some links to resources that students can look into for additional learning or more information on VC to facilitate their education.
Absolutely, yeah. A lot of folks have helped me along my path here, and so happy to pay it forward. I have a few suggestions on how people may consider their skills that they have today in the light of what it looks like in the VC world, and I have some suggestions on how they can, a framework, let's say, of how they can arrive at whether or not VC or any other, area for that matter is something they'd like to develop or build a career towards. So happy to share those with you after.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.